Back in 2017, Kia did the unthinkable. They released the all-new Stinger, their first rear-wheel drive sports car, and they called it direct competition to the Audi A5 Sportback and the BMW 4 Series Grand Coupe. That was definitely strong talk. Now, to be perfectly honest, not too many Audi and BMW shoppers ended up cross-shopping the Stinger with those German alternatives, and that's why Stinger sales have been relatively low in the United States. But that doesn't change the fact that this is an absolutely fantastic sedan and a really good deal. If you're shopping for any sedan around $45,000 or just above, just below, you should put the Stinger on your shopping list. That means if you're shopping for a Camry, an Accord, an Altima, a Maxima, or an Acura TLX, I would probably get the Stinger instead, unless you absolutely needed a really big back seat. Clearly, I'm talking about fully loaded versions of the competition. The Camry tops out just under $39,000, the Avalon just under $44,000, the Nissan Maxima goes up to over $45,000, the Acura TLX right up to $53,000, which is where this model stops. You could also look at this as an alternative to the Mazda 6 Turbo, Dodge Charger, etc. Up front, we have a tweaked version of the front-end design that the Stinger launched with. Some interesting geometric shapes here in the bumper that are repeated in the headlamp modules and the tail lamp modules as well. The Kia logo has changed. This is the new Kia logo design. It's a little bit sharper and cleaner. We have integrated front parking sensors on this version. Rear parking sensors are standard, as are LED headlights, but not the ones this model has on it. These are the steering projector headlights. You'll find those in the top-end trims. Lower-end trims get reflectors. The ducts on either side of the bumper are fully functional. From here you can also see those LED turn signals, but it's worth noting that the vents that you see on top of the hood, these are not functional. They are just styling. At 190.2 inches long, the Stinger is solidly a mid-size sedan in America. This is almost exactly the same size as the Legacy, about 2 inches shorter than the Camry and the Accord. But when you approach the Stinger, you'll notice immediately that the proportions are very different. The proportions are much more like the BMW 4 Series Grand Coupe. Not just because this is a Sportback or Liftback, whatever you want to call that hatch in the rear, but because this is also a rear-wheel drive vehicle. So you notice that that front tire is pushed much further towards the front than in the Camry or the Accord. That's because in terms of drivetrain design, this is much more similar to the average BMW or Mercedes than the average Camry or Accord. That V6 engine under the hood is sitting approximately on top of the front axle. About half of it is behind the front axle, and the entire transmission is well behind the front axle as well. Now you can get this with all-wheel drive in addition to rear-wheel drive, so if you're worried about winter traction, that's another reason you might want to get the Stinger, because you cannot get a V6 Camry with all-wheel drive or a 2-liter Accord with all-wheel drive. In fact, if you want a mid-size sedan in America with all-wheel drive, you either have to choose less power, like the 2.5-liter 4-cylinder in the Camry, or you have to choose something with a CVT, like the Subaru Legacy. Back here, we do have a Sportback or a Liftback design rather than a traditional trunk, and that's why Kia originally called this a competitor to the Sportback variants of the A5 and the A7, or of course, the BMW Grand Coupe line. Unlike most of the supposed German 4-door coupes, however, the Kia actually gives us frames on the windows that makes the interior much quieter. It also helps reduce cost. As you'd expect out of a performance vehicle, we have big brakes up front and in the rear, Brembos if you get the 3.3-liter twin-turbo engine. We also get 19-inch wheels with a 3.3-liter engine. Optional summer tires are available, and they're staggered tires in this vehicle, 225s up front, 255s in the rear. The Sportback lid features a subtle spoiler on top. We have full LED tail lamps back here with amber turn signals, which is a nice touch. Parking sensors are standard on every Stinger model. The quad exhaust tips you'll find only on the 3.3-liter twin-turbo model. These are all four functional, but they are just a little bit difficult to clean the way that they're designed. On the inside, you'll see the actual exhaust tip. The chrome ring is part of the bumper, and then there's some additional texturing going on down there to help improve the appearance. Down below, we have some aero treatment to the bottom of the bumper to help smooth the air as it exits the vehicle. For the last number of years, Kia has offered a strangely comprehensive lineup of mid-size sedans. They've offered 4 different models that were sized within 10 inches of one another. The Stinger is the smallest of the bunch. This is rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive, V6 or 4-cylinder. We then have the K5, formerly known as the Optima. That's the direct Camry competitor. We also had the Cadenza. That was a V6 front-wheel drive vehicle, not turbocharged. That was designed to compete very directly with the Avalon. And then we had the K900, which is somewhat related to the Stinger here. That was twin-turbo V6 and all-wheel drive standard. That was Kia's BMW 5 Series, basically. But for 2022, they've sliced things in half, and we only have the Stinger and the K5. If you want all-wheel drive with extra power, that's going to be found in this. If you want a front-wheel drive Camry competitor, that's going to be the K5. Although you can get the 2.5-liter turbocharged engine in that K5. To make their mid-size sedan lineup make a bit more sense, they've positioned the Stinger above the K5. So we find a ton of standard feature content on this vehicle, like leather upholstery, a ton of driver assistance tech. All the ones you see on the side of your screen are standard on every Stinger model, including rear parking sensors. We have dual zone climate control, the big touchscreen infotainment system as well. All of that is standard on every model. Now, if you're jumping up from a top-end Camry or a top-end Accord or even a top-end K5, you may have to leave a few features behind in order to get the rear-wheel drive dynamics of the Stinger, but a lot of those options can be added to this as well, if you're willing to pay a little bit extra. Any way you slice it, the Stinger should be more expensive than the K5. Pop the hood and you'll really see what separates the Stinger from the rest of the mainstream competition. This has an all-turbocharged engine lineup. That's not too unusual for 2022, but these engines are arranged longitudinally, not transversely across the engine bay. That's because, again, this is a rear-wheel drive vehicle. Things start out with a new 2.5-liter four-cylinder turbocharged engine that produces 300 horsepower and 311 pound-feet of torque. That is standard on the Stinger. It's connected to an 8-speed automatic transmission and your choice of rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. That model will get you 0 to 60 in 5.7 seconds. That is just about as fast as a Camry V6 or an Accord 2.0T. Only again, if you want all-wheel drive, you can do that on this, and you can't on the Camry V6 or that Accord in any form. If you want a bit more power and you want to go way faster than the Camry or the Accord, you could get this engine. It's a 3.3-liter twin-turbo engine, basically borrowed out of the Genesis lineup of vehicles. This produces 368 horsepower and 376 pound-feet of torque. That's good enough to get this vehicle from 0 to 60 in 4.6 seconds. That's definitely Audi or BMW territory, and it has a 167-mile-an-hour top speed in case you're interested. Fuel economy has never really been Kia's forte. This will range between 20 and 25 miles per gallon. Obviously, the best fuel economy is with the base engine. The worst fuel economy is going to be with the 3.3-liter twin-turbo and all-wheel drive. The entire time I've been driving this vehicle, I keep being reminded of the Acura TLX Type S. Now, the two vehicles are very different in structure. The TLX Type S has a lot more weight on the front axle because its 3-liter turbo is entirely in front of the front axle, and as you can see here, only about one cylinder of this 3.3-liter 6 is in front of the front axle. The rest and the transmission, that's entirely behind the front axle. So this has a nearly perfect weight balance. Kia doesn't exactly give us an exact number there. It's probably somewhere around 51 or 52% of the weight on the front axle. The TLX, it's pretty front heavy, and the TLX is actually heavier than this in its fully loaded form, about 200 pounds or so. Leather upholstery and a power driver's seat are standard. If you work your way up to the upper end trims, then we get a more adjustable driver's seat with a power extending thigh cushion and 4-way adjustable lumbar support. We also have an available powered tilt telescopic steering column. A manual tilt telescopic steering column is standard. This model has a power passenger seat, but that's optional as well. The front passenger seat doesn't have the same range of motion as the driver's seat. It is missing the inflatable bolsters and the extending thigh cushion. It does have a 4-way lumbar support, which is a nice touch. For me, at least, one of the surprising things about the Stinger is the amount of legroom that we have in here. This has 79 inches of combined legroom, front row plus second row. It's important to use those combined legroom numbers because the front seat tracks do move further rearward than we find in some of the competition. So if you're a taller person, you may find the front seats more comfortable than the Camry, even though the Camry will give you a little bit more combined legroom. It's simply the way it's apportioned inside. Now, the Accord has a ton of legroom in the rear, almost 4 inches more than this, but it actually doesn't really have any more headroom. In fact, headroom back here is pretty similar to the Accord, the Mazda 6, and the Subaru Legacy. It's nearly an inch better than the Acura TLX. It's also a little bit wider than some of those other options. If I move over here to the middle seat, you'll notice that the back seat is wider, but I can't go all the way over to the right because that front seat is all the way back in its tracks and my feet simply wouldn't fit in the footwell. If you routinely carry passengers in the back seat that are over 6 feet tall, you might want to consider the Camry. It definitely has more headroom than we find in the Stinger, but most of the other mid-size sedans are going to be pretty similar to this. Nice touch back here. We have not just air vents in the rear, but also a form of 3-zone climate control. You can adjust how hot or how warm you want the air relative to the air that's coming out of the front vents. As you'd expect in a rear-wheel drive vehicle, we have a pretty big bump for the drive shaft that goes to the rear. Rear seat passengers get 2 cup holders, a fold-down center armrest, and the rear seats fold in a 60-40 fashion. Cargo capacity and cargo practicality are 2 big reasons to get the Stinger over the average Camry or Accord. Thanks to the Sportback or liftback design, again, whatever you want to call it, you can put much bigger items in here than you could in the average sedan. If you're the kind of person that wants to go to Home Depot and just on a whim buy a new barbecue, you could definitely do that in the Stinger, and you couldn't in the average sedan. I was able to fit 4 24-inch roller bags back here. This particular one is a 22-inch roller bag, but you can see that the height of this cargo divider really is the limitation for 24-inch roller bags. This just barely fits under there. If, however, you were to pull this out and rearrange your luggage, I could get 5 bags back here, which is definitely a little bit above the average mid-size sedan. Under the load floor, we find something a little bit unusual. If you're comparing this to the European options, we find a temporary spare tire. The observant among you will notice this little cable right over here next to the spare tire. That's because the battery is located back here in the trunk, just as it is in the average European performance sedan. Rounding out the features that help get the Stinger 10 out of 10 points in my exclusive trunk comfort index is the power hatch. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that you're going to see some features that you won't find on the base model. We have a fabric headliner here, decently sized moonroof, but it's not a full panoramic design. It doesn't go to over the rear seats there at all. You can see that the window line definitely drops towards the rear, and visibility out the back is definitely a little bit more limited thanks to the sporty design here. We have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, 4-way adjustable headrests. Leather upholstery is standard, but not exactly the leather upholstery you see in this model. As you'd expect in a vehicle with a performance mission, the front seats have pretty aggressive bolstering on the seat back, but the seat bottom cushion is not quite as aggressively bolstered, so I don't think larger folks should have any trouble with these seats. Moving over to the front doors, we have a high level of soft touch material going on here. This definitely feels more premium than the K5 or the Camry or the Accord. Some real metal trim going on the doors right there. You can see right there around that speaker grille. The door handle itself is plastic, but the trim around it is metal. It's an interesting blend of imitation metal and real metal in here, actually, because the strip that runs across the dashboard and that strip right there across the door by the armrest, that's imitation. Over here we see more of that imitation metal going on this strip right there around the air vents, across the dashboard, etc. We find the large touchscreen infotainment system, and you can see the ambient lighting strip that runs over there on the passenger side of the dashboard. Right there to the center, there's a purple stripe right there above that, and then very faintly you can see the purple ambient lighting strip right there. The glove compartment is a bin stock compartment. I was barely able to fit a 10-inch tablet computer inside, but some larger ones probably won't fit. Going back over to the middle of the dashboard, we find a standard just over 10-inch infotainment touch display. This supports Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. It's running the latest version of the software from Kia, and it's definitely an upgrade over what we saw in the pre-refresh Stinger. In addition to the display being larger and the bezel being slimmer, I think it's better integrated into the dashboard as well. If we go back to the home screen here, you can see the native Kia interface. This is their latest version of the software. It supports the home screen view like we see in modern Genesis and Hyundai vehicles as well. It's basically the same software package adapted to Kia here. There's information from the infotainment system over here on the left. There are multiple profiles supported, moving map display there next to it if you have the factory navigation interface. If we go over to settings here, let's talk about some of the vehicle settings that I think you should know about. The first one is under drive mode. This vehicle does have a custom drive mode in addition to the dedicated ones from the company there. But worth noting, the suspension system, it's adaptive, but it only has 2 settings, comfort and sport. I would really love a little bit more adaptability. The other thing to know is the active sound design option here. You can turn off the augmented engine noises. Augmented engine noises are not something I'm a huge fan of, so I like it in off, but if you want more augmented engine noises, you can definitely choose that option. It definitely is more subtle than some of the engine noises that we find in modern Ford products. Zooming out from there, you can see the ambient lighting strip behind the display. We have 2 large air vents, lots of soft touch materials here. This center section of the dashboard is actually stitched. The upper section is injection molded and then after stitched to look sort of like this midsection. Keyless Go is standard, as are physical buttons for the infotainment system, so no touch buttons here like we find in some modern Kias. Power button there, direct access buttons to a variety of different features, standard dual zone automatic climate control. There's a Qi wireless charging mat down here, but we don't have wireless CarPlay, so you still have to connect the cord, and then there's not quite enough room for some of those larger smartphones to actually fit in there and then close the lid here. More real metal trim here, combined with imitation metal, for instance, the little touches right here on the parking brake. It's a joystick style shifter, 2 big cup holders there, drive mode selector, auto brake hold, controls for the heated and ventilated seats, a button to turn off the parking sensors, button to turn off auto start stop if that's something that you hate, and a button to activate the 360-degree camera system if the vehicle is so equipped. Behind that we have a large padded center armrest. It offers a reasonable amount of storage. Again, remember the transmission is mostly under this area, so there is no under center console storage area, and this is going to be a little bit shallower than some of those front-wheel drive alternatives. Over on the driver's side, this model has a heads-up display. You can just about see it right there. That's that bump above the steering wheel. Unlike some of the newer Kias, however, we don't have a full LCD instrument cluster. We have 2 different LCDs, a 7-inch, which is what you see here, and a smaller 4-inch display in the base model. The software is pretty similar, gives you turn-by-turn navigation directions if you have that option there, status of the vehicle's active safety systems, digital speedometer, some extra gauge readouts there, for instance, boost and the torque from the engine, also a range figure, and then your pretty typical trip computer information readouts. Aside from the logo update, the steering wheel design hasn't really changed too much. It's still a flat bottom design. It's more thinly rimmed than some of the SRT wheels that we find in the Dodge lineup, but I think this is a good middle ground for some folks. Paddle shifters on the back, down on the left, up over there on the right. The controls for the standard adaptive cruise control system over here on the right side, as well as Kia's lane keeping assistance system. They call that the highway driving assist. It's aggressive lane keeping for highway use. Over here on this side, we find controls for the infotainment system. First, let's talk about the Stinger's performance numbers, and then we'll talk about how this compares. This certainly has an urgency that we don't see in something like an Acura TLX, even in Type S format. 0 to 60 in this model happened in 4.7 seconds with a reasonable amount of rear end slip. Thankfully, a limited slip differential is available in the Stinger, and that's one of the things that separates this from even some luxury entries like an Infiniti Q50 Red Sport. You won't find that particular functionality in that model. Of course, all-wheel drive is needed if you want the fastest 0 to 60 time. If you get the 3.3-liter turbo and all-wheel drive, this will do that in 4.6 seconds without launch control, occasionally perhaps just a little bit faster with the launch control mode. Thanks to the summer tires that this model is wearing, I stopped from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 109 feet. That is definitely a short and aggressive stopping distance, and that's likely why some folks have complained about rotors warping in the Stinger. The brakes in this vehicle are pretty big. They're just a hair smaller than some of the performance entries in the luxury segment, but the curb weight of this is a little bit higher than some of the German options, so definitely keep that in mind. This is going to be an awful lot less expensive to replace brakes on, however, so I think it's not really too much of a problem. And you do have to drive this pretty hard before you notice any braking issues. Whether or not that matters to you depends on what exactly you want to try and compare the Stinger to. So let's dive into that now. You could logically compare this to, again, an Audi A5 or a BMW 4 Series Grand Coupe. I like the weight balance and I like the feel of this a little bit better than the Audi A5. This reminds me in terms of its weight balance, definitely more of a Mercedes-Benz C-Class or a BMW 3 or 4 Series. But this lacks the sort of suspension polish that we find in the BMW or in the Mercedes. Some of that is likely suspension design. The front suspension is not a double wishbone suspension like we typically find in a lot of European vehicles. Instead, it's a less expensive McPherson strut design. There's nothing necessarily wrong with the McPherson strut design. It's a little bit less complicated, but doesn't offer the same sort of adjustment ability and fine-tuning and contact patch that we find in a double wishbone suspension. It's, again, a bit more common in some of the European options. What that means to you is that this won't feel quite as nimble when you really push it super duper hard, but again, dynamically, this is going to feel much more like the BMW than even the Audi. And certainly a significant step above the Camry and the Accord. This is so much fun to drive out on your favorite winding mountain road, and thanks to the good weight balance here, this is going to feel not only more fun than the TLX on the way up the hill because it's actually rear-wheel drive, it's also going to feel really fun on the way down the hill because the weight balance is good. One oddity with the TLX is that yes, it can send up to 70% of power to the rear axle sometimes, but it's not going to do that all the time, and when you're going down the hill, it's still relatively front heavy. And you'll really notice that if you drive this back to back with that Acura. Since I first drove the Stinger, Kia has tweaked the suspension tuning just a little bit, and this no longer feels like it has a little bit of rear end lift in some of the corners like the pre-refresh Stinger did. But you should keep in mind that the Stinger is still relatively heavy. This weighs just over 4,000 pounds, so this is going to be heavier than the closest competitors in the luxury segment. Again, the A5, the 4 Series, etc. On the other hand, the Stinger with the V6 and all-wheel drive still manages to be 200 pounds lighter approximately than the Acura TLX Type S, even though the TLX has a smaller engine and only one turbo. Out on a rougher road like the one that I'm on here, I'm going to give ride quality a B-. The way that the suspension is tuned in the Stinger is my only minor complaint, and I will classify this as a minor one. With the adaptive suspension system, the springs are obviously a little on the softer side of the sporty segment, and the dampers are tuned a little on the firmer side of things. So when you're tooling down a road like this, a gravel road with some dips and some bumps, etc., you can feel all of the smaller imperfections coming through into the cabin, even if I'm in the comfort mode. But out on the open highway, larger imperfections on the highway, those are well controlled and well damped. In many ways, this suspension tuning reminds me a great deal of some modern Volvos that use an adaptive suspension system, but not the airbag technology. So for instance, not the kind of system we find in the XC90. In my cabin noise testing at 50 miles an hour, I measured 69.5 decibels in here. That's just a hair louder than the last time I tested the Stinger, so I'm going to give this a solid A when it comes to cabin noise. This is quieter than most versions of the Camry, Accord, Altima, etc. in that segment. We have acoustic laminated side glass and an acoustic laminated windshield. Even though the Stinger has a lift back there and the cargo area is part of the same area as the cabin, they put a really thick cargo divider in there that definitely blocks a lot more sound than I thought. Over a week of mixed driving, I've been averaging 21 mpg. This particular model is EPA rated for 20. I'm going to give this a C when it comes to fuel economy because very clearly you will find more efficient options out there. You will get better fuel economy and better performance in a BMW 440i, but it's going to cost more than the Stinger, and the difference is not going to be that large. In real-world driving, you're probably only going to be about 2 to 3 mpg ahead. Now let's talk pricing. For 2022, the Stinger starts at $36,290. That gets you the GT line trim, which has the base 300 horsepower 4-cylinder turbo engine and rear-wheel drive. You can add all-wheel drive to that model for $38,490, and there's one option package available that adds a moonroof, navigation, premium auto, and a power passenger seat. If you want to try and comparably equip the 4-cylinder Stinger similar to something like a top-end Camry or a top-end Accord, you're going to need that package on it. But let's talk about what you give up if you were to try and move from something like a Camry V6 or the Accord 2.0T or the top-end turbocharged version of the Altima and move over into something like a Stinger because you want those rear-wheel drive dynamics. You are going to have to give up a few things. You're going to have to give up adaptive dampers, which you will find on some of those options. Variable gear ratio steering, that's not on the base model. Moonroof, power trunk lid. You get a small 4.2-inch color LCD in the instrument cluster. No HomeLink transmitter. There's a little bit of LED lighting on the inside, but a lot of it has been removed. There's a manual passenger seat, no driver's seat memory. The base audio system in the Stinger is a 9-speaker system, so it is pretty decent, but it's not the up-level system that's available in the model that I was driving. And you'll also have to give up the heads-up display that you will find standard on some of those alternatives. Also, the base version of the Stinger rides on 18-inch wheels. Now, personally for me, I think that is a worthwhile trade-off to get the improved driving dynamics, and most importantly, the improved performance in the Stinger. It's going to drive and feel very differently from a Camry or an Accord or an Altima out on the road. It is a lot more fun because of the rear-wheel drive design. And also importantly, if you want all-wheel drive, you can get it in the Stinger, and you cannot get an all-wheel drive option on the Camry V6 for some reason, or the Accord at all, or on the Altima with a 2-liter turbo. For some reason, in the vehicles in the mainstream midsize segment that offer all-wheel drive, it's always on the less powerful engine. Really, the only turbocharged option in that segment that has all-wheel drive is going to be the Subaru Legacy, and it's not going to perform like a Stinger. Of course, where the Stinger really shines is the model with the 3.3-liter twin-turbo V6. That's going to set you back at least $43,890, and if you get a loaded GT2 all-wheel drive, that's going to bump things up to $54,895. Now let's dive into the competition. The most direct competition in my mind is the Volkswagen Arteon. Format-wise, it's a very similar vehicle. It's also a slightly larger than midsize sedan-looking vehicle, but it has a liftback or a sportback in the rear. Price-wise, it's pretty similar as well. It starts a little bit more expensive for 2022, $36,995, and goes up to $48,585. So it's going to be a little bit more expensive than the base 4-cylinder version of the Stinger. Now keep in mind that you will find more features in the top-end version of the Arteon than you'll find in the 4-cylinder Stinger, but all of those features are also available in the Stinger. You just have to get the 3.3-liter turbo. Price-wise, I actually think that the Stinger is a much better value than the Arteon, because feature for feature, you're going to get more power in the Stinger, even though sometimes you may pay a little bit more for those top-end features. At least it's compensated by the improved driving dynamics and a lot of power. Now, the Arteon has standard all-wheel drive, which is a nice touch, but if you're after rear-wheel drive dynamics, then you can do that in the Stinger. You can't do that in the Arteon. It's a front-wheel drive-based all-wheel drive system. Now, it does give you 300 horsepower. It got a pretty decent power bump for 2022, but dynamically, the Arteon is just going to be very different. It is excellent, don't get me wrong. The Arteon drives very, very nicely. It just doesn't drive like a rear-wheel drive sports car, and that is exactly what we see in the Stinger. Now, on the other hand, the Arteon is roomier on the inside. It has more cargo room and, importantly, more legroom in the back, and that's all due to the design of the vehicle. Having the engine transverse across the engine bay rather than the rear-wheel drive design simply means that the vehicle is packaged better. The hood is shorter, so for a vehicle that is about the same size on the outside, you get more interior room. Next up, we have the Dodge Charger. Kind of an odd competitor here because it's not a liftback and it's pretty big, but it's in a pretty similar price range, and it's also a rear-wheel drive vehicle, one of the few vehicles in this segment that is more or less sedan-shaped and rear-wheel drive with decent performance. It starts less expensive, $31,125. That gets you the base V6 engine. If you want the 5.7-liter V8, and trust me, you probably do, that's going to be $38,125. Performance-wise, oddly enough, the 3.3-liter turbo in the Stinger is a lot closer to the 6.4-liter V8 in the Charger, just due to the design of the vehicles and the fact that the Charger is pretty heavy. Now, the 6.4-liter V8 will set you back at least $56,000, more or less comparably equipped to the top-end version of the Stinger. So price-wise, they're pretty similar. The Charger is going to be a little bit more expensive, but likely have a bigger discount on the dealer lot. An important thing to know, however, is that if you want all-wheel drive on your Charger, you can get it, but you can only get it with the V6 engine for some reason. There is no all-wheel drive V8. If you're looking for the last muscle car standing in America, that's going to be the Charger. If you want something that's a little bit more cargo practical, a little bit more nimble, a little bit more modern feeling, that's going to be the Kia Stinger. Next up, the Acura TLX. This is an interesting comparison because the TLX has a turbocharged 6-cylinder engine and a turbocharged 4-cylinder engine. It has a torque vectoring all-wheel drive system available, and it is not quite a full-on luxury vehicle. Acura doesn't really consider themselves quite a direct competitor to a Mercedes-Benz C-Class, for instance. They consider themselves a value alternative to a luxury car, and in many ways, that's what Kia is trying to do with the Stinger as well. So I think this comparison is appropriate. Now, the TLX is going to be a little bit more expensive. It starts at $37,700. Feature set is actually pretty close on those models. The base 4-cylinder engine is not going to give you quite as much oomph as we find in the Stinger, and performance is definitely going to be a step behind. The Acura 10-speed automatic transmission is an excellent transmission, but due to the very design of front-wheel drive vehicles and the fact that torque is probably being limited in first and second gear, especially with the new TLX Type S, performance figures are always going to be a step behind what we see in the Stinger. So 2-liter versus 2-liter, the Stinger is going to be faster. V6 versus V6, the Stinger is also going to be faster. If you want the 2-liter turbo TLX with all-wheel drive, that's going to be $39,900. And if you want the Type S, that's $53,600. Again, still not quite as swift as the Stinger. As far as build quality, there are a few areas where I think the Acura interior excels over the Stinger, but there are also areas where I think the Stinger comes across as more premium on the inside than the TLX. Most notably, some of the dashboard components I think are more harmonious inside the Stinger. If you take a look at the left-hand side of the TLX's dashboard, there's kind of a discordant array of different plastics all joining together. Not exactly my preference. I think things are done a little bit better in the Stinger. Now let's take a look at one of Kia's supposed competitors, the Audi A5 Sportback. I say supposed competitor because I'm pretty sure that Kia knows in their heart of hearts that very few Audi shoppers or BMW shoppers or Mercedes shoppers are going to consider going to the Kia dealer to take a look at the Stinger. But I know a lot of people that might be interested in a Stinger saying, well, I'm looking at the Stinger, it's a great deal, and I like it compared to some of these others. So it's sort of an alternative, not really a competitor, I would say. Now the A5 is going to feel smaller, it's going to feel more nimble, it's going to feel a little bit more dramatic, a little bit more connected. I do like the steering in the A5, and I like the fit and finish and the interior quality in the A5. The Stinger is a step removed from that, but it's a lot closer than you might think. And it's also a pretty good deal. 300 horsepower is standard, 261 horsepower is standard in the A5, so you get more power. You also get a little bit more room on the inside. And we get a smoother transmission. Because the A5, in order to get better fuel economy, it is going to be better fuel economy than the Stinger, it uses a dual clutch transmission. And that dual clutch transmission is never going to be as smooth as the 8-speed automatic that we find in the Stinger. Standard all-wheel drive on the A5 could be either a pro or a con, depending on how you want to look at it. If you want that rear-wheel drive driving dynamic, you're going to find that in the Stinger. You're not going to find that at all in the A5 because all-wheel drive is standard. Bottom lining the Stinger is honestly pretty easy. This is one of the best new cars available in America that few people know about, and even fewer people will end up considering shopping for. I would argue that if you're shopping for a Camry V6 or an Accord 2.0T or an Altima 2.0T, you should just get the base version of the Stinger. For me, I would be willing to give up some of the creature comforts that you will find in those top-end Camry and Accord models for the extra performance and the extra driving enjoyment, driving fun that we find in the Stinger. I think that is an absolutely worthy trade. I think the ultimate problem for the Kia Stinger is simply that the price tag can get up to about $50,000 and it still has a Kia logo on the front. I think that Honda could get away with the price tag this high a little bit more easily than Kia, and that's really a shame because this is an absolutely excellent vehicle. And I would also argue that if you're shopping for that Acura TLX, you should just get the Stinger instead. It's a better vehicle all the way around. Also the same thing with the Volkswagen Arteon. And if you're looking at something like a BMW 4 Series or an Audi A5, and you're not quite sure if you want to spend the money on those vehicles, I would argue you should be willing to take a look at the Kia Stinger. Now, again, I completely understand that Kia is not a luxury brand, so not too many BMW or Audi shoppers are going to be willing to lower themselves and go to a mainstream brand, whether it's Kia or Toyota or Honda. But I would also suggest that you should try. If you're willing to think about that and put the brand out of your mind, you should definitely take a look at the Kia Stinger. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comments section below, and let me know what you think about the future of the Kia Stinger. It does appear to be on shaky ground. Kia has not sold as many as they were hoping for. They really had hoped that this model would sell at least like a Chrysler 300 or perhaps a Toyota Avalon, and the Stinger sales numbers just have never been there. I think that's a real shame. but it just seems to be the way the market is going right now. Everybody seems to be more interested in Kia's crossovers. Telluride sales are on fire, Sorento sales are on fire, etc. And the Stinger has just been sort of left at the back of the pack. Let me know what you think about all that. Be sure to head over to the merch store at awaymerch.com. That's where you can buy merch right like this. You can also find me over at facebook.com/AlexNauto's Instagram, all those other social places, and I'll see all of you next week.